Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and we go on an excommunication vacation with Frederick II. Thank you so much for voting for this series, patrons. You make this whole series possible, including Lies, which is an integral part of the series. And I just want to jump in real fast so that we can get all our points covered. First of all, we are on Nebula First. If you want to go see the first episode of our History of Cats series, it's over there. It's going to cover the taming and domestication of cats, which came relatively late. Even did foxes before cats. Before we start, I also just wanted to say that I just passed my 7th anniversary as head writer of Extra History. I started on March 1st, 2018. As head writer, thank you so much for hanging with me through all of that time and enjoying history and coming here to talk about it. I really appreciate it. It's been a journey. It's been really fun, and thanks so much. I also want to talk about one thing before we get to our recommended reading, which is some of you mentioned in the comments that we seem to be doing a different upload schedule. We talked about it before, but we are now doing every other week and a longer episode. So it's the same amount of time discussing history, but it's a release schedule that's a little more forgiving on the production side. It also is more in line with what YouTube privileges now. You know, the algorithm changes, and we were finding that longer videos get more boost, which we have found. And it's helpful in a lot of ways. Also, 3 episodes, there's less of an audience drop-off between each one. And it just, all around, it's a little easier on us. It's a little better on YouTube. And we're going to stick with it for now and see how it goes. We'd basically done the same kind of release schedule and episode length for, over a decade. So it was probably time for a shakeup. Recommended reading, I've got 2 books and the rest of it's going to be in the description. There'll be a full bibliography down there. We used a lot of academic articles for this particular topic for reasons we'll get into. You do need professors to interpret Frederick II for you. He's not an easy figure to tackle just as a layman. But 2 great biographies are Frederick II, The Wonder of the World by Richard D. Bressler, and Frederick II, A Medieval Emperor by David Abulafia. These are really good books, but again, like getting that very granular, like Frederick II and his relationship with Jewish populations in Sicily is, a big deal. You do want to get an academic viewpoint on him. So just some general things. Patron question from Flubbadubba: what exactly were the popes so worried about with regards to potentially being absorbed? I think the main thing to remember is that in this era, like we're very used to the Pope being a spiritual figure and having this little enclave of the Vatican, but not really being a political force. This is a fairly new thing, right? And this is absolutely not true in this period. There are the papal states. The idea is that the Pope will have earthly political power that will help protect his spiritual power, right? The crossed keys that we talked about in episode 3, right? The War of the Crossed Keys. Those crossed keys are the symbol of the papacy, and that is one key is the political, it's the earthly world, and the spiritual world, right? So it's the idea of the Pope as a political leader and the papal states as a political unit is still very much a thing at this time. It's not unusual for the papal states to go to war against other states in Italy. It's not unusual for the Pope to be a even military leader at times, right? And be a political actor. Think of the Pazzi conspiracy, right? And I would argue personally that the papal states are a very difficult bit of geopolitical geography, right? There's the Italian peninsula. Rome is right in the middle of it. That's great if you're an empire that's governing the entirety of the Italian peninsula plus some, like they are in the days of ancient Rome. But that is not very good when you are surrounded by other possibly more powerful, possibly hostile states, right? If you're in the middle of a peninsula and you've got unfriendly neighbors to your north and south, that is a bad place to be. And even if you have coastline on either side, We're getting to a period where navies are starting to become more powerful. People are starting to get really organized about moving troops around by sea. So that could be a vulnerability in itself. So I think that that has a big part of the papacy's fear of being surrounded, right? Because then you're down to the spiritual power, and that, as we see with Frederick, right? That's not always convincing. Episode 1, patron question from Gage Hardsty. I noticed that you mentioned that Richard the Lionheart was captured, and Matt said it was Henry VI that captured him during the Second Crusade, but to me that's incorrect because following the Saladin series and the Eleanor of Aquitaine series, he was captured during the Third Crusade. Yep, this was a error in narration that I just didn't catch when I was reviewing the episode. Someone else mentioned that we replaced Otto's O with Frederick's F when Frederick II was eating at Otto's banquet, so there was 2 people marked Frederick. Was this on purpose or just an accident? It was just an art accident. Sometimes they managed to get through a review process. However, because this was noticed on Nebula, we were able to fix it, upload a new version to Nebula, and then the version we uploaded to YouTube was correct from the beginning. YouTube makes it very difficult to re-upload a video. We basically lose our traffic, we lose any momentum we have with the algorithm. So something has to be like something that I would consider like a cosmetic error like that is probably not worth it unless it has to be a big deal, because we're going to take a hit financially from re-uploading something to YouTube. We don't with Nebula. So if someone notices something on Nebula and we're like, oh, we need to change that, we can do a new frame, we can re-upload it, no harm, no foul, and then it gets the corrected version gets posted to YouTube. So that's a really nice thing. So thank you for noticing when it was on Nebula. Patron question from Kappas. It really pulls me ears to hear. That means, it's difficult to hear Germany so often because these are rather loosely connected German states, independent principalities, free cities, etc. And a vote of emperor wasn't just a thing of the nobility, but also bishops of powerful cities and later the Czech king. Totally understandable. And it sounds weird to me too, right? I did most of my study in the early modern era where you are very careful about when you say Germany, right? But these actually are modern translations of terms at the time. There is still this idea of the German people groups or Germany as like a territory. So actually the title he's getting that is translated into English as King of Germany is Rex Teutonicum, or King of the Teutons, right? So the same way we'd say Teutonic Knights, and we mentally are like, oh, German Knights, right? The Holy Roman Empire is also the Rex Italiae, or King of Italy, right? There's no Italy, quote unquote, nation, but there is this idea that Italy is an area. It is possibly nebulously a people. So this is in a similar vein. I've recommended it before, but if you are interested in this, and I think everyone to a certain extent should be interested in this because it will change your idea of how you look at nationalism and how you look at history. There's a book called The Myth of Nations, and it's all about how in the period when nationalism was developing, people are very specifically going back in history and looking at like the Gauls, right? And the Alemanni from Roman sources and being like, these are proto-French. These are the original Germans, and they are not, right? This doesn't make any sense when you look at the facts of it, but it's a really intrinsic part of how we have formed national identities. This book, Patrick Geary's The Myth of Nations, I have said before, it is not a fun read. It is a very dull read. Go, at the very least, read the introduction, because you can basically get the idea from the introduction. It is very important. It is an important thing to understand, and it will change how you look at basically everything, but especially how we have constructed our modern identities of what countries are what, and how on what shaky ground that is. And you will never look back at the Gauls and be like, well, these are really the French people. That's kind of an illusion we've created for ourselves. But it's a great book, The Myth of Nations. I know I just made it a hard sell to actually go, but go to the library, go read it. It's really important. It will change your ideas of this. And it will show you how difficult this kind of like linguistic stuff is, where people thought of like Italy at one point as a region versus a nation versus a people. And the same thing with Germany, that there are these terms like Teutonic that like existed before that we use, but it all gets mixed together and confused, and they meant different things at different times. And we just kind of have to go with the words that we have, but also acknowledge that they have a really weird history often. Episode 2, you missed the opportunity to say, why let a bit of excommunication get in the way of a good crusade? What's something big I can hit myself with? I don't really have anything that works. I'll use one of my typing gloves. I need to just put like a post-it note on my computer that say like, do the crusade thing. I'm pretty sure that we had this in as a joke in the second episode. I think it got deleted for word count, or we were going to move it around, or we decided we were going to do it in a third episode, then we didn't, thinking we did in the second episode. I was still convinced that we actually did it. I had to go look back. This has happened multiple times to me now. I need to just like put some kind of like reminder. I'll just put like a reminder in my calendar that's like, have you done a crusade joke? I did an upcoming series that mentions the crusade, not series, one-off that mentions the crusade. And I also didn't do the joke, now that I think about it. Do the joke, Rob. Say the thing. It's the Bart Simpson meme, right? Say it. Say the thing, Bart. Yeah, I swear we did. But we didn't. YouTube question 626, small correction. The Dome of the Rock is depicted in this image as blue with a gold dome, but the blue tiles were only added in the 16th century and the dome itself wasn't plated in gold until around 1960. Yeah, we could do a really interesting series on kind of the evolution of the Temple Mount. That would be really interesting. It would be like a full 3-episode series, though. I just want to mention that the tiles on the Dome of the Rock are the specific type of Ottoman ceramics called Iznik ceramics that start in the early modern period. If you really want to see this, where you go is Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Beautiful place, beautiful city. And the history of these tiles is really interesting because Ottoman sultans were very big on Chinese porcelain. Lots of people, in the 16th century in Europe were big on Chinese porcelain, right? It's a very exotic good. It's this beautiful blue and white. It's extremely vibrant. It's kind of translucent. It's incredibly hard. It's, much more difficult to damage. But the thing about ceramics is one of the reasons they're so valuable for historians and archaeologists is not only can you track kind of the pattern dispersal, right? Oh, we know we know there was trade here because we see this pattern of pottery there. Or we know that there was cultural contact between these two groups because we see this pattern from their pottery reflected in this other type of pottery from somewhere else, right? But also, pottery is very specific to the clay it is made out of. So you cannot make Chinese porcelain anywhere other than where it is made, right? Because you don't have that kind of clay. So in the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman artisans had to figure out how to make a local version that looked in a little bit like Chinese porcelain, and Iznik ceramics are what results. So it's not a copy. It's saying, well, this is really neat. Let's try and find out how to make a local version that we will have our own type of art and our own type of, but it's also blue and white, right? So yeah, go see Topkapi Palace. 9 minutes, it's almost certainly not cholera since that sickness had its first recorded breakout in 1817 as far as I know. Yeah, so I should have said a cholera-like illness. So mentions of a disease that may have been cholera or related to cholera or like cholera actually go back to Hippocrates and Galen. There's mentions of it in the 16th century or something that could be cholera. But the first cholera pandemic where it was identified was in 1817. It's probably around in some form before then, but we don't really know. Cholera is really gnarly. It's super gross. It's just constant vomiting and diarrhea. It's really yucky. In fact, there's been some really interesting writing about how comparing the artistic representation of cholera and tuberculosis, because as we've mentioned in our tuberculosis episode, tuberculosis was like sexualized in a really weird and gross way, but you cannot do that with cholera because it's so disgusting. And by the way, I just want to mention we're in a cholera pandemic now. We have been since 1960. It just does not impact industrialized nations, probably because of water treatment. So, but this is something that breaks out in refugee camps a lot. It is still very much with us. The 1990s had one of the last, not the last because it's still going on, but really, really bad outbreaks that just killed tons and tons of people, in Rwanda in particular. I suspect it's going to show up in the Lies episode, but something that may be relevant to what people are picturing when they hear Frederick had a harem is that harem doesn't mean the same thing in the Islamic world as it does in the modern colloquial. In Muslim households, a harem is a section of the house reserved exclusively for women. It doesn't necessarily denote having multiple wives or concubines. While he may have had lovers on the side, which wasn't uncommon for rulers of the day, that likely wouldn't be a part the diplomat would have considered relevant in regards to finding common cultural ground. So I do want to say that this scene, this like kind of letter, is like more of an invented scene on my part. That he had good relations with Muslim diplomats before, right, he left for crusade. But I want to get into this idea of Frederick and harems. So that very much could have been propaganda spin, which we talk about in episode 3. This is episode 2. But it's not really clear what they mean when they say he keeps a harem. There were Christian traditions that we kind of associate now more with the Muslim world, right? There was a history of veiling, for example. Medieval women covered their hair. Actually, Islam got it from Christianity. You know, it eventually got to a point in Christianity where only nuns were doing that. But in the Middle Ages, this is still very much a thing, right? You look at these big headdresses, that's what they're for, right? Also, I think there probably was something just beyond him having mistresses that played into this. I think it could have been something as simple as when he was on crusade, he was in a palace that did have a harem, where he put, you know, his mistresses. I think like he could have been like experimenting essentially, right? And I also think that, and he did supposedly pick up concubines overseas that were Muslim, and this could have been like the origin of it. I also think it's very interesting that his second wife is basically locked away, right? So we do see him like cloistering one of his wives, where she's kind of like starved of social contact. Just nobody sees her. She gives birth and she just disappears. So that could be part of the origin of that. People were very unhappy about that. He was overall pretty bad to women in his life. We didn't get into that so much, but Frederick, as is probably clear from someone who has had a cruel streak, was not great to the women in his life. So maybe this is an interpretation of that. But I actually wouldn't be so quick to say, no, we're just, you know, we shouldn't understand it that way. Maybe we should. Or maybe because of his contact with Islam in the Second Crusade and in Sicily, he either picked up ideas or people put that on him, that he was, you know, he did have this history of keeping wives and mistresses away from the public. And then because of his contact with Islam, people like put those two and two together and were like, they were in a harem, you know? But I'm not so quick to say that that is not a thing. I think there's probably some misinterpretation of it, but I don't know. It's one of those things that's difficult to say. Someone mentioned Frederick's dealings in Bohemia was a real-life Game of Thrones that affected the whole Czech nation to this day. Yeah, we didn't focus on that very much, but you know, all this stuff that's going on peripherally is still very important and is still like affecting people's lives quite a bit. Episode 3, patron question from Martin Viren. Is anyone else wondering what would have happened if Wi-Fi had been around and Frederick II and the other characters in this series had social media accounts? We made this joke with Garibaldi, so I didn't want to do it again. So I went with the card game instead. But I feel like Frederick would have had a Instagram or a TikTok like just full of bird videos, or like, you know, that aircraft mechanic that he's talking about some like aircraft safety thing, and then suddenly he's talking about Lord of the Rings. I feel like that would be Frederick. Like he'd be talking about some political thing, and then suddenly he'd be talking like at length about birds. YouTube question. I think it's interesting how the things that made Frederick the Antichrist wasn't his cruelty to peasants, which is frankly par for the course, but simply his issue with papal authority. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, you know, they have this idea of this great chain of being, and the idea of like oppressing peasants, that's going along with the great chain of being, whereas spiritually the Pope is supposed to be above you, so bucking against that, that's against the natural order, whereas you know, stepping on peasants is that's part of the natural order. I think also the fact that Frederick disobeys the Pope, even or just ignores excommunications, and yet still succeeds, is even more undermining of papal authority. I think that's what makes him so dangerous, is he goes on and still wins, right? So it kind of puts the lie to this idea that if the Pope excommunicates you, you are cursed by God and cast out, right? It's simultaneously undercutting the spiritual authority and the political authority when he's fighting, particularly Gregory. Someone mentioned when Gregory died, the cardinals actually did pretty easily choose a new pope, Celestine IV. The election took only a month. The problem is Celestine promptly died 17 days later, after which it took them a year and a half to elect Innocent IV. Yeah, we simplified a little bit. The conclave kind of had to take a mulligan on that one. And it was mentioned while Fibonacci may have been the first European to discover the Fibonacci sequence, it had been known in India since 400 BC. Yep, but that's what he's known for, so that's what I mentioned to it. A lot of you wanted to know which man digested better. Don't just leave us hanging. I kind of have to. The story is more focused on the cruelty of the experiment than the results of the experiment. Yeah, that's not, the emphasis is definitely on just Frederick is a monster. And I just want to say, this is often the first story people hear about Frederick. When I was a teenager, I was in a medieval reenactment group called the SCA, Society of Creative Anachronism, and this is how I heard about Frederick, is like someone telling me this funny story about like all these crazy things Frederick did, including one that was apocryphal about him inviting an astrologer to the palace and taking him to the roof and saying, how far away is the sky? And the astrologer tells him. And then he takes him back to his chambers, and then that night he like built a platform that makes it higher, and secretly builds this platform that or raises it 5 feet. I think it was supposed to be 5 or 10 feet, and says, how high is the sky now? And he doesn't give the right number, so he has him executed. I've never found evidence of that being real, so it's not in the show, but this is often how people hear about Frederick for the first time. And a lot of you said, actually, that's Frederick Barbarossa that's under the mountain. It is now. That's the thing, is Frederick II was originally the king that was supposed to be under the mountain, that was going to emerge in a time of crisis. But over time, his legacy was kind of forgotten, and Frederick Barbarossa was more talked up, so he became the Frederick that was under the mountain. And the story changed. These legends are not immutable, right? So that's an interesting example of someone's kind of memory being devalued and someone else being valued above them, but it's still a Frederick. Coming up on Extra History, the history of cats, fabulous felines. This is going to be super fun. First one's up on Nebula. Mutiny on the Bounty, Rebellion, Resilience, Revolution, and Revenge. This has been such an interesting series. And by the way, if you think your vote does not matter on Patreon, or if you think I'm not going to be a patron because what does one vote matter? This series won by 1 vote. And I'm sorry for all of you that voted for Antarctic exploration. I'm sure we will get to that at some time. I want to do Shackleton stuff too. So don't worry, that'll come back around. And I've had a really fun time writing this series. As many of you know, I'm from the Pacific, so I love writing about this kind of stuff, and I have some background in this kind of stuff. I took a Europeans of the Pacific course in college that was fantastic. We are now voting on Things Fall Apart. This is going to be a series about when institutions fail, when the world order suddenly changes. No reason, just felt right. Yeah. Ibn Battuta's side trip, I wanted to talk a little bit about the way we interpret documents about Frederick and the idea of history changing, quote unquote. There's a lot of talk these days about revisionist history and history changing, but that's just kind of how it has to go, right? Like, imagine if a modern political figure, let's get a little distance and say like Obama and George W. Bush, right? Imagine they were kings and you had the kind of record keeping that you had during the Middle Ages where documents are spread out between different, the Vatican has its very extensive and very well preserved document archive. There's maybe not as good preservation in like England or in the rest of Italy or in what is now Germany. And it's 300, 400 years later, and you're looking at these records, and the records you see on Obama are like, this guy is a communist who wanted to take everyone's guns and who was secretly Muslim. And those are the documents you see. Those are the ones that ended up got preserved from the historical lottery. And so you write a book that's like, clearly Obama was a secret Muslim who hated America and was a communist, right? Or you write a book about George W. Bush that is like, Bush definitely did 9/11, right? So it's very dependent on what is preserved and what you have access to at any one time. And, we see this with Frederick II. It's a very clear line, right? That his memory is very based on Vatican records, that it's all about like how he is an atheist, he is doing all these horrible science experiments on people, he hates Christianity, and he, loves Islam, but also hates Islam because he's an atheist. This stuff doesn't always make total sense. But then you have a wave of historians that come through later who are more amenable to the idea of atheism and don't like the idea of like the Middle Ages as a superstitious time. And they're like, Frederick is a Renaissance man. He is a brilliant scientist who, fought against the tyranny of, papal superstition and whatever. He's a proto-Protestant. And that now we learn more about his time. And now in a modern context, we're like, he was a very interesting, very intelligent figure. He's not a man out of time. He's not a Renaissance man for certain. He has very conventional ideas about royal Christianity and kings at this time. This is just kind of how they thought about spirituality and power and the medieval crown and the medieval state. But yeah, he is unusual in that he is a writer and a poet, and he writes these books on bird anatomy that are very interesting and to a certain extent revolutionary, but he's not like a scientist. And that a lot of the things that we based our ideas on him about are propaganda, or likely propaganda, or we just don't really know what to make of them, right? Like with the Harem thing, right? So we are, to a certain extent, as historians, both at the mercy of the documents that survive and the biases of our own time. And we often have to reevaluate when we learn more, or we learn more about the period that puts things in context that were not in proper context before. So that's what I want to leave you with, is that we are at the mercy of the records, but it always helps to take a step back and understand where they're coming from and we are coming from, and just try and make our way from there. See you later.
I would like to take a minute, so just sit right there, to tell you how Angelo Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter C. Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, Lotus Wolf, and Ziliad's Architectures became the best patrons in Bel Air. I mean, the internet.